Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I woke up to my phone buzzing on the nightstand and the faint, steady hum of my bedroom fan. For a few seconds I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out why my alarm was going off early. I usually set it for 7:30 a.m., not 7:15 a.m. The screen on my phone was lit with notifications. There were 3 missed calls from my sister Megan, a couple of messages from work, and a bright red emergency alert banner across the top. I rubbed my eyes and unlocked the phone. The emergency alert text filled the screen. Emergency alert. Public safety event in progress in your area. Stay indoors. Await further instructions. Do not travel unless absolutely necessary. Underneath it, Megan's last text was timestamped 6:52 a.m. Caleb, something is wrong downtown. People are panicking. Call me. There was another one a minute later. Answer your phone, please. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Megan didn't panic easily. She managed a small gym near downtown Loveland, and she was the one who talked everybody else down when the power blinked or a pipe leaked. I tapped the callback icon. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then jumped to voicemail. Hey, you've reached Megan. Leave. I hung up, called again, and got the same thing. No ring this time, just straight to voicemail. That usually meant the phone was off or the network was overloaded. I swung my legs out of bed, set my phone on the dresser, and walked over to the bedroom window. The blinds were half open. From here, I could see a slice of the Cedar Ridge neighborhood, a mix of 2-story wood frame houses and tidy lawns. The sun was low over the foothills to the west, throwing long shadows between the houses. At first glance, nothing looked wrong. A car backed out of a driveway down the block. Sprinklers ran in someone's yard, spraying arcs over a patch of grass that always looked too green for Colorado. Then I noticed the sound. It wasn't a siren or an explosion or anything dramatic. It was a steady layer under the normal neighborhood noise, a distant, disorganized roar. It reminded me of the crowd near the stage at a festival, only scattered across too wide an area and out of sync. Shouts, a faint honk, something that could have been a scream but was too far away to be sure. My front yard faced a small cul-de-sac. The irrigation canal ran behind the property line at the back, down a shallow embankment and along the rear fences in a concrete-lined trench. Usually there was only a few inches of water moving through it, enough to feed the sprinklers in the subdivision. I couldn't see it from the bedroom, but I knew it was there. I'd walked along it plenty of times when I wanted a shortcut to the main road. I grabbed my jeans off the chair, pulled them on, and headed downstairs. The house creaked the way it always did in the mornings as it warmed up. The thermostat on the hallway wall said 68 degrees inside. The weather app I opened as I walked said 59 degrees outside. Early autumn, clear skies, high expected around 62. It should have been a normal day. I turned on the TV in the living room and flipped to a news channel out of Denver. The anchor's voice was steady but tight around the edges. A red ticker crawled along the bottom. Reports continuing to come in from multiple locations across the Front Range. Authorities are advising residents to remain home and avoid large gatherings. Hospitals in Denver, Aurora, and Fort Collins are reporting an overwhelming influx of patients. We are working to confirm the nature of the events. Again, if you are at home, stay there. The feed jumped to a shaky video from someone's phone. The sound cut out while they blurred part of the footage, then came back. There were people running through a park, some of them chasing others. I saw someone tackle another person and drive them to the ground. The camera jerked away before anything else was visible and pointed toward the sky. The anchor resumed talking in a measured tone. I picked up the remote and muted the TV. My heart was pounding too loudly to listen. Outside, a car sped past the house on the 2-lane street, then another. That was already unusual for our quiet little loop this early. I walked to the front door, checked the deadbolt, then opened it a fraction and peered through the gap. Janet Ruiz from 3 houses down was in my front yard, halfway up the path. She was in sweatpants and a hoodie, hair pulled into a quick knot, face flushed and eyes wide. She looked up when the door opened. "Caleb, are you home?" she shouted. "I'm here," I said. "What's going on?" She jogged the last few steps to the porch and lowered her voice, although anyone listening would have still heard her. "Something is wrong on Maple," she said. "People are attacking each other. I saw someone bite a guy and he did not react like a normal person. They kept coming after the police tried to stop them. You need to lock your doors." "Did you call 911? I asked automatically. "They're not answering," she said. "It just rings, then cuts off. The news is saying to stay home. I'm going back to my place to get the kids in the basement." Over her shoulder, past the small trees lining our sidewalk, I saw movement at the intersection where Cedar Ridge met the main road. 2 figures staggered into the neighborhood, their steps uneven. They didn't look drunk. They looked wrong, stiff at the joints, heads tilted at unnatural angles, as if they were focusing too hard on things that weren't there. "Janet, get inside," I said. "Seriously, go." She followed my gaze, saw them, and her face drained of color. "Oh no," she whispered. "They're already here." She turned and ran back the way she had come, cutting diagonally across the grass toward her house. One of the staggering figures turned its head. Even from this distance, I could see the way its attention snapped toward movement. Its body took a second to catch up as it pivoted. I shut the door and locked it, more out of reflex than reason. My pulse thudded in my throat. I walked through the house and checked every lock: front door, back sliding door, garage entry, side gate bolt through the small utility window. All secure. The house suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before. My tools were in the garage. Years of electrical jobs had left me with more than I needed. A decent cordless drill, extra batteries, hammer, pry bars, screwdrivers, metal mounting brackets, boxes of wood screws, anchors, cable ties, and various odd pieces of lumber leaning against the far wall. 2x4s, 2x6s, and a couple of sheets of 1/2-inch plywood. I stood in the doorway to the garage, hands on my hips, listening to the sounds outside. It was louder now. Sirens to the east, sporadic shouts from the main road. I heard a car door slam and someone yell for another person to hurry up. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping it was Megan, but it was just a repeated emergency alert and a message from my job's group chat. Someone had written, "Shop is closed. Stay safe. Manager says to stay home. Phones are overloaded." No one was talking about what was actually happening. I opened the voice call app and tried Megan again. Same result, straight to voicemail. I knew the layout of my house better than any commercial job I had ever wired. 2 stories, about 1,700 square feet. Living room, half bath, and kitchen on the ground floor, with sliding glass doors opening to a small concrete patio and fenced backyard. 3 bedrooms and 2 full baths upstairs. Attic access from the hallway ceiling. Crawl space under part of the first floor where the foundation stepped down. Windows were double-pane vinyl, installed when the subdivision was built. Not exactly secure if someone determined pushed hard enough, but better than single pane. I walked a circuit through the ground floor, looking at every entry point not as a homeowner, but as someone trying to break in. The front door was solid wood, with a decent deadbolt, but the screws in the strike plate were the cheap 1/2-inch ones that come into the box. The sliding back door was tempered glass with a simple latch. It could be popped off its track with enough force if the latch failed. If people were panicking, there would be break-ins and theft. That was my initial thought. I had not yet accepted the word that was forming in the back of my mind: infection. I went back into the garage and started hauling materials into the living room. 2x4s, the drill, long 3-inch deck screws, metal L brackets, a box of extra drywall screws. The air in the house felt warmer as I moved around, like the building itself was reacting to the activity. I unscrewed the little decorative strike plate on the front door frame, pulled it off, and took a look at the lumber underneath. As expected, the screws holding the latch plate were barely longer than my fingernail. I backed them out and replaced them with 3-inch screws, driving them deep into the underlying stud until the metal seated firmly, then added an extra L bracket above the deadbolt and anchored it to the frame with more long screws. It wouldn't turn the house into a fortress, but it would take more force to kick the door in. From the garage, I brought in 2 2x4s long enough to span the front door. I cut notches into the drywall on either side at about waist height, found the studs with a stud finder, and screwed short horizontal blocks into them. Then I screwed the 2x4s across on the inside like crossbars. It looked improvised, but it was solid. If someone tried to ram the door, their force would distribute across the crossbars into the studs rather than just the latch. While I worked, I kept an ear out for noise. The sirens were closer now. A police cruiser tore past on the main road, its engine at high revs, siren wailing, then cut abruptly. A second later, there was a crunchy sound in the distance, like metal hitting something solid. I paused, drill in hand, and listened. No more siren, just shouts. A faint popping noise spaced out in sharp bursts. I knew that sound from the range. It was gunfire. The TV in the living room was still on mute. I unmuted it. The news channel had switched to live aerial footage from a helicopter over Denver. Freeways were jammed with stopped cars. People were leaving vehicles on foot, some moving in groups, some alone. There were clusters of people on overpasses, some running, some falling. The anchor's voice was tense now, the professionalism giving way to stress. We are receiving unconfirmed reports from multiple cities of individuals who are not responding to normal deterrence methods. Authorities are referring to this as an infectious event. The exact nature of the infection is still unknown, but residents are being advised to avoid contact with anyone exhibiting aggressive or abnormal behavior. They did not use the word that was in my head. They did not say zombies. They did not need to. I turned the TV back to mute. I did not need more panic in my ears. I needed to focus on practical steps. I moved to the sliding glass door. There was a cheap latch that clipped the 2 panes together when closed. I locked it, then cut a length of wooden dowel from the garage and dropped it into the bottom track between the edge of the sliding pane and the frame so it could not open, even if the latch failed. Then I screwed 2 metal brackets into the wall above the door and slid another 2x4 into them as a horizontal brace. The glass could still break, but the frame itself would be harder to shove inward. In the kitchen, the window above the sink looked out over the backyard. It had a simple lock, easy enough to defeat with a rock. I lowered the blinds, but left a small gap at the bottom for visibility. I did the same with the windows in the living room, closing blinds and curtains enough to hide movement inside, but leaving thin slits at the sides, where I could check outside without being seen easily. It took me about 45 minutes to get the ground floor to where I felt it would slow down anyone trying to come in, not stop them completely, but buy time. I checked my phone again. Still no messages from Megan. The network icon showed 1 bar, then 0, then back to 1. I tried calling her one more time, staring at the screen while it tried to connect. It failed again. In the kitchen pantry, I took stock of food. 2 cases of canned soup, a dozen cans of beans, rice in a 5-pound bag, pasta, a couple of jars of peanut butter, granola bars, enough for about 3 or 4 days alone if I rationed, maybe more if I stretched it and stayed calm. Bottled water filled the bottom shelf. I had 4 gallons in plastic containers, plus whatever was in the tap. But if the municipal system took a hit, that could stop at any time. The fridge held meat, eggs, fresh vegetables, and milk. All the things that would go bad if the power went out for long. Upstairs, I pulled a duffel bag from the closet and began building a backup kit, just in case I had to leave in a hurry. It wasn't because I was planning to leave. At that point, I was still telling myself I would ride this out in the house. It was just a contingency. I packed a couple of changes of clothes, underwear, thick socks, a fleece, and a rain shell, sturdy gloves, a baseball cap, my small first aid kit with bandages, antiseptic wipes, painkillers, and a roll of gauze. I added a headlamp and spare batteries, my multi-tool, a simple folding knife, and a small flashlight. Then I went to the drawer beside my bed and took out the handgun I kept there. It was a Glock 19 with a 15-round magazine, chambered in 9x19mm. I'd bought it after a string of break-ins years earlier, taken a safety course, and gone to the range once every few months. I was comfortable with it, but I had never pointed it at another human being. I checked the chamber, verified it was clear, then inserted a loaded magazine and chambered a round. I set the pistol in its holster, slid it into the duffel, and added 2 more full magazines. I also grabbed my small looking metal cash box with some emergency bills and dropped that in as well. From my work gear, I added a compact digital multimeter, insulated screwdrivers, a roll of electrical tape, wire cutters, a set of zip ties, and a small 12-volt inverter rated for about 300 watts. That inverter had already saved me on a couple of jobs when the power was out, and I needed low-wattage tools or laptop power. I usually ran it off a deep-cycle marine battery I had in the garage for backup. I dragged that battery inside now and set it near the dining room wall outlet so the inverter could be close to where I would sit. By the time I finished packing and made a checklist of what else to grab in a hurry, it was a little after 9 a.m. The light outside was brighter now, the sky a clear, almost hard blue over the foothills. The sounds, however, were wrong. There were still cars, but more of them were stopping and starting instead of just flowing through. I heard horns, shouting, and that same distant tide of panicked noise. I walked upstairs, went to the front-facing bedroom window and carefully peeled back the edge of the blinds. On the street at the far end of the cul-de-sac, near the entrance to the neighborhood, a small group of people were struggling in the middle of the road. A woman was on her back, kicking, while 2 figures leaned over her. One of them jerked its head in fast, repetitive motions toward her midsection. The movement was mechanical and steady. The third person, a man in a t-shirt and shorts, was pulling on one of the attackers, yelling. His voice reached me faintly in broken words. "Get off! Stop! Please!" The attacker didn't react to his pulling. It twisted its body in an unnatural way to keep its focus on the person lying on the ground. The second attacker shifted toward the man in shorts, turning slowly until it faced him. Its clothes were torn and stained. Its arms were covered in marks, its hands hanging at the wrists until it began to move. It started toward him without hesitating. The man let go and stumbled backward. He looked around frantically, then turned and ran toward the next intersection. The attacker followed, not sprinting, but moving at a steady, relentless pace. The second attacker stayed with the person on the ground. I let the blinds fall back into place. My throat felt dry, and I swallowed without much relief. That brief glimpse had been enough. These were not normal assaults. There was something deeply wrong with the way those attackers moved and ignored pain or distraction. I knew now that those people were not going to get back up in the usual sense. The person on the ground would not be calling anyone for help later. It was almost a relief to acknowledge it silently. Zombies. Not the movie kind with dramatic music, but real human bodies that were no longer behaving like living people. The news channel had said infectious, not curable. The emergency alert had said to stay home, not to seek treatment. I walked downstairs and took a deep breath. My hands shook slightly. I clenched them into fists and relaxed them until the tremor subsided. There were practical things to do, and I clung to those. I swapped the inverter leads onto the marine battery and checked the voltage with the multimeter. The display read 12.6 volts, a full charge, enough to run a radio and a couple of low-watt LED lamps for days if I rationed. I plugged a small AM/FM radio into the inverter and turned it on. A soft hiss filled the room until I tuned to a local AM news station. The host's usual morning chatter was gone, replaced by a continuous loop of emergency instructions. If you are at home, stay there. Lock all doors and windows. Do not attempt to assist anyone showing signs of aggression or unresponsiveness. Avoid contact with bodily fluids. Local authorities are working to regain control of the situation. We repeat, stay indoors and await further instructions. The loop repeated, with occasional interruptions where a live voice would give a short update and then drop back to the script. As late morning turned to afternoon, the neighborhood changed. Traffic on the main road slowed to a crawl and then to a complete stop. I heard metal hitting metal as someone rear-ended another car. People shouted at each other, then fell silent. A moment later, the crowd noise rose in a different tone and stayed up. More people began cutting through the subdivision streets, trying to bypass the jam. Some ran, some limped, some walked with a stiffness that looked familiar now. Every time I peeked through the blinds, I saw more of the latter and fewer of the former. At one point, around noon, someone pounded on my front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I froze where I stood in the hallway. The pounding came again, 3 quick blows. "Hey, is anyone in there?" a male voice shouted. He sounded winded and angry. I stood just to the side of the entryway, out of line with the tiny decorative glass panel, and listened without answering. My heart was hammering. Every cell in my body wanted to help someone who sounded scared. Every other part of my brain was repeating the radio's advice like a mantra. Do not open the door. You do not know if he is infected. One person inside becomes a problem you cannot contain. The pounding eased. I heard him curse, then footsteps running away from the porch. A second later, he shouted something I could not catch, followed by a raw, desperate yell cut off abruptly. I heard a thud and then nothing but that distant, awful murmur of the crowd a few blocks away. I closed my eyes and stood very still in the hallway for a long moment. I knew exactly where the front door gun safe was, the code I could have entered in a few seconds, the way I could have cracked it and handed someone a tool. I did none of that. I told myself it was because I could not tell who he was or if he was uninfected. The truth was, I was afraid. Outside, a siren wailed closer, then faded again. I heard no more knocking on my door that day. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the temperature dropped. Early autumn in Loveland was usually comfortable, but when you stayed still and kept the furnace off to avoid drawing power, the house cooled down quickly. I pulled on a sweatshirt and walked the perimeter one more time, checking barricades and locks. At the kitchen window, I saw movement in the backyard of the house behind mine. A woman in jeans and a flannel shirt was dragging a mattress against her back door, trying to wedge it upright. 2 small children clung to her legs as she worked. She pushed them toward the sliding glass door, shouting something, but the kids resisted. Near their fence line, 3 figures stood pressed against the wooden slats, fingers hooked into the gaps between boards, their heads pushed forward, faces almost touching the wood. Their bodies rocked gently with small, steady movements. The woman did not notice them yet. Her back was to them as she tried to calm the children. I wanted to tap on my own window, to shout, to warn her, but the 3 figures at her fence were already moving, their hands dragging along the slats. They found a section where the wood was slightly warped and began pushing. The boards creaked. The woman turned at the sound, saw them, and froze for a half second. Then she grabbed the children by the arms and dragged them inside, slamming the door behind her. The 3 figures continued to push at the fence. I backed away from my window. I could not help her without opening mine. I could not shout without drawing their eyes toward me. The sun dropped below the western foothills and took with it any illusion of normalcy. Streetlights flicked on one by one along Cedar Ridge, casting yellowish pools on the asphalt. The sky turned a deep blue, fading toward black. The noise from the main road, instead of decreasing as it did on a normal evening, built into a layered wall of sound. The first time I heard the collective sound of dozens of infected people moving together, I felt my knees weaken slightly. It was not a roar. It was a constant mixture of low vocalizations, shuffling footsteps, occasional impacts against cars or fences, and strained human voices further away. It went on without the breaks of conversation or quiet you normally hear in crowds. There was no laughter, no random small talk, just a steady, grinding presence. I stood in the darkened living room, listening, and realized I could not leave any lights visible from outside if I wanted to avoid adding to that wave. I switched off the ceiling lights and turned on a single small LED lantern on the coffee table. I moved it away from the windows so that any glow would be diffused. The radio on the inverter hissed softly between emergency messages. Around 8:30 p.m., there was a brief tone on the radio and then a live voice that clearly came from a different source. It was an official announcement, calm and controlled. This is the Colorado Emergency Management Agency. All residents along the Front Range, including Denver, Aurora, Boulder, Fort Collins, Greeley, and surrounding communities, are advised to shelter in place. Law enforcement and military units are engaged in containment operations. Do not attempt to evacuate at this time. Highways are compromised and travel is unsafe. If you are in a secure location with supplies, stay there. Further instructions will be broadcast as available. They did not say anything about how long we would need to wait. They did not say they had this under control. They only said to stay put. Outside my front door, footsteps scraped along the sidewalk. I turned down the radio volume and held my breath. A dull thud sounded against my front wall, followed by another. Something brushed against the door itself. Then fingers curled over the lower edge of the living room window frame, pressed against the glass, slid away. The footsteps moved on. I stayed in the living room for most of the night, dozing in short, restless stretches on the couch, pistol on the coffee table within reach. Every time the house creaked or the wind brushed against the siding, I woke up and listened for more significant sounds. Around midnight, the sirens diminished. The steady noise of the main road became deeper and more sustained, less frantic. There were fewer horns now and more unbroken crowd noise. At some point around 2 a.m., I woke from a light doze to the sound of breaking glass. It came from somewhere on my street, but not my house. A crash, then a high, sharp scream cut off too quickly, followed by a series of dull impacts and then silence. I lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, feeling every heartbeat in my neck. I told myself that the barricades I had built would hold. I told myself that the infected were likely more attracted to loud noises and obvious movement than to a quiet, dark house. I reminded myself that I needed to stay calm if I wanted to think clearly tomorrow. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under for a few more fitful hours. When my eyes opened again, it was already getting light. The fan in my bedroom had stopped. The house was quiet in a different way. The usual hum of the refrigerator was gone. I checked the oven clock on instinct. Its digital display was blank. The power had gone out. I checked my phone. The battery was at 70%. The network icon was a bare outline now, with no bars and a little X beside it. Whatever cell towers were still running were not talking to my little slice of Cedar Ridge. I moved from room to room, confirming what I already knew. No lights, no furnace, no internet. My modem and router lights were dark. In the garage, I checked the main breaker panel out of habit. All the individual breakers were still set, but the main line side read 0 on the multimeter. Somewhere upstream, a line had tripped or come down. There was nothing I could do about that. The grid was someone else's problem now. Back inside, I switched the radio to run off its internal batteries instead of the inverter to conserve the marine battery for later. The AM station was still broadcasting, though the signal faded in and out, with occasional bursts of static. The message had not changed in substance. Shelter in place. Do not attempt to travel. Avoid contact with infected individuals. Medical facilities were at capacity. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, drank half, and then filled a couple of pitchers and every spare container I had. I filled my bathtub halfway as an extra reserve. It felt strange, preparing for the water to stop, but the power failing made it suddenly much more likely. Once I had done what I could on that front, I went to the front-facing bedroom window again and took a careful look outside. There were more of them now. At least 24 infected people wandered along the street, and through front yards within my line of sight. Some bumped against parked cars, leaving smears and dents, then moved on. Others stood stock still in the middle of lawns, heads oriented toward any sound that carried. Occasionally, one would let out a low, prolonged vocalization, not quite a shout or a moan, just a sustained noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Across the cul-de-sac, one of my neighbour's front doors hung open crookedly, the frame splintered. There was no movement inside, but something dark streaked the interior wall near the doorway. I did not look too closely at it. I watched as one infected individual walked straight into a mailbox, hit it with enough force to knock it sideways, then kept going without any sign of pain or awareness. Another tripped over a garden hose and fell, lay still for a few seconds, then began to push itself back up in the same mechanical, uncoordinated way I had seen at the intersection the day before. When one of them bumped against my front fence, I instinctively ducked back from the window. Their hand slid along the top of the wooden slats, fingers curling over the edge. They walked along the fence line, feeling it, until they reached the corner, then turned randomly and began moving toward another house. The infected did not appear to be coordinated. They did not move in ranks or follow a leader, but their numbers made them functionally similar to a single large hazard. You could plan for one unpredictable element. Planning for dozens required distance or solid barriers. I knew the house was not built for a siege. It was a wood-frame suburban home, designed to be comfortable, not to withstand sustained pressure at its doors and windows. My fortifications were temporary upgrades at best. I pulled down the attic hatch in the hallway ceiling and unfolded the ladder. The wooden rungs felt cool and slightly dusty under my hands. I climbed up, pushing the panel aside and hauling myself into the narrow space under the roof. The attic was unfinished, just insulation between the joists and a narrow plank walkway laid down for service access. I moved carefully, stepping only on the joists and avoiding the loose insulation. The air was dry and dusty, with faint traces of old construction wood. At the far end, near the front of the house, there was a small rectangular gable vent covered with slats. It faced the street. From below in the living room, you couldn't see it, but from up here, it was the perfect observation point. I crouched behind the vent, peering through the slats. It gave me a better angle on the street than any of my windows. No one below could see me without climbing up to the roof and looking straight in. From this vantage point, the scale of the problem became clearer. The main road beyond Cedar Ridge was visible through gaps between houses and trees. It was a sea of stopped cars. Some were at odd angles, where drivers had tried to pull onto the shoulder or turn around. A few vehicles had collided, forming little clusters of twisted metal. There were people moving between the cars, but even from this distance, I could tell the difference between the living and the infected. The living walked with purpose and fear, heads turning, arms held close, steps quick. The infected drifted, often bumping into obstacles and changing direction only when blocked. In the distance, smoke rose from somewhere closer to town. I could not see exact details, only the grey column pushing into the clear blue sky. On my own street, the density of infected was slowly increasing. They moved unpredictably, but never very fast, and they showed a disturbing persistence toward noise. Whenever a distant car horn sounded, or a shout carried on the wind, several heads would turn in that direction, and a fraction of the infected would begin moving that way. At one point, a dog somewhere to the west began barking rapidly and loudly. Within minutes, a small cluster of infected shifted toward that sound, converged, and eventually disappeared from view in that direction. The barking cut off abruptly. No more followed. It was a clear demonstration of cause and effect. If I made loud noise, they would come. I backed away from the vent and sat on the narrow plank, thinking. So far, the infected had not shown any clear interest in houses that were quiet and closed. They bumped into fences and exterior walls randomly, but they did not focus on one point for long unless something triggered them. My house was essentially blending into the background, and I needed to keep it that way. The problem was time. I had roughly 3 days of food, maybe more if I stretched it. The horde outside appeared to be building, not thinning. The emergency alert messages on the radio had not changed. No one had driven through the neighborhood on a loudspeaker telling us help was on the way. I had not heard any helicopters since late last night. There were 2 main strategies available: stay until the house failed, or leave before that happened, when the density of infected might still allow a small window of escape. Leaving meant exposing myself in the open for at least several hundred yards, if not more, depending on the route. Staying meant hoping the structure and my supplies lasted long enough for someone else to fix the world. I thought about Megan. She lived in an apartment complex near the intersection of Eisenhower Boulevard and Lincoln Avenue, about 3.5 miles from my place if you followed the streets. Under normal circumstances, it was a 15-minute drive. On foot, avoiding main roads, it would be a long, risky trek. I imagined her sitting in her 3rd-floor unit with the TV off and the door locked, wondering if I was all right. I pictured her refreshing her phone over and over, just like I had been doing. She might already be dealing with infected in her hallway. The idea of sitting in my house doing nothing while she faced this alone made my chest ache. I went back downstairs and made another circuit of the barricades. The front door crossbars held firm when I leaned against them. The back sliding door brace was solid. In the backyard, I could just see the top of the concrete-lined irrigation canal beyond my fence through a knothole. It ran parallel to the property line, about 8 feet across, with 3 or 4 feet of water flowing most days. Under normal use, it carried water to various distribution points along the neighborhood's irrigation system. I had walked along its banks before, taking a shortcut toward a small retail center when I didn't feel like following the sidewalk with its extra turns. The canal passed under several streets in concrete box culverts, low and narrow tunnels that could be walked through if you didn't mind crouching. It eventually curved closer to the main commercial strip, passing within a couple of blocks of Megan's apartment complex before joining a larger drainage path. If the infected were mostly on the streets and sidewalks, the canal might be a less trafficked route. The water would be cold and the footing slick, but it would keep me off the asphalt where most of the visible trouble was. Getting to it would be the first challenge. I pulled a street map of Loveland from my desk drawer. I still had a paper map from the days before I trusted my phone for every direction. I spread it on the dining table and traced the canal's path in my mind, matching the blue line to the real route I remembered. From my backyard, if I dropped straight into the canal, I could follow it east, passing under at least 2 major cross streets via culverts. One of those would be near a small park, which might be a gathering point for both survivors and infected. The other passed near a strip mall with a grocery store and a pharmacy. That area could be either a resource or a hazard. If I stayed in the canal and moved slowly, staying low, I might avoid drawing attention. The tall weeds and grasses growing along certain uncovered stretches would add concealment. The culverts would give me some protection when I passed under roads, though they could also confine me if infected were nearby when I entered. I spent the next hour going between the map, the attic vent, and the backyard knothole, cross-checking what I could see with what I remembered. The infected density along the main road continued to rise. Twice, I saw a small group of apparently uninfected people try to move through the cars, only to be cut off and surrounded. I watched one man climb onto the roof of a pickup truck, swinging a piece of pipe to keep 3 infected at bay. He did a decent job for about 30 seconds. Then another infected came from behind and grabbed his leg. He went down in a tangle of limbs and movement. I turned my eyes away. Inside my house, by contrast, nothing moved except me. The refrigerator was silent. The clock on the oven was a blank rectangle. The radio murmured its limited phrases. I could hear my own breathing when I stood still. By late afternoon of the second day, I knew I could not simply wait for help. Nothing about the outside pattern suggested rescue was imminent. If anything, the infected seemed to be concentrating in residential areas as more people tried to flee in cars and on foot, drawing their attention and leaving others more isolated. Around 5 p.m., The sun dipped toward the foothills again, shadows lengthening across the street. The temperature dropped into the mid-50s. According to the last reading my phone's weather app had cached, inside it felt cooler still. That was when I heard the first serious impact on my house itself. It came from the back, a heavy, hollow thump against the fence, followed by the sound of wood protesting. I moved to the kitchen, stayed a foot back from the window, and peered through the narrow gap at the side of the blinds. 3 infected had reached my backyard fence line. One leaned against it with its whole weight, pressing its head and shoulders against the boards, while the other 2 drifted near the corner where the fence met the neighbor's yard. Their movements were slow, but their mass was real. Wood is not a permanent barrier against repeated force. The infected that leaned against the fence slid along it. Its shoulders pushed hard enough that the boards bowed slightly inward. The top of the fence wobbled. If a large enough group pressed against it at once, it would eventually give. As I watched, another infected figure appeared from the direction of the canal, climbing up the small slope from the concrete edge. That was a detail I had been hoping not to see. They were not avoiding the canal. They just did not favor it. They could still wander into it and out of it at random. The new arrival walked along the fence, dragging its hand across the boards, then joined the first one pressing against them. The creaking grew louder. I stepped away from the window. Every instinct urged me to fire a shot through the boards to knock them back. A single 9mm round would pierce wood and likely pass through an infected skull. It would also crack like a whip in the quiet evening air and call every infected within several hundred yards straight to my yard. Noise was their magnet. I could not afford to be that magnet yet. Instead, I went to the garage for more reinforcement. I dragged a heavy shelving unit from along the side wall into the house and positioned it against the back wall in the living room, where it shared a boundary with the backyard fence line. I stacked boxes of old books and tools on it to add mass. It wasn't a direct reinforcement for the fence, but it would add some inertia to that section of wall if anything came through. Then, I checked the sliding door brace again, pushing my shoulder into it. It held. On impulse, I added another 2x4 at an angle from the floor to the door frame, creating a crude strut to spread force into the floor joists. It was a patch on a patch, but it made me feel like I had done something. As the second evening fully set in, the neighborhood outside my house sounded more crowded. The infected did not communicate in any organized way, but the combined noise of their presence carried. I ate a can of soup cold from the pantry to conserve inverter power. I drank sparingly from one of the water containers and forced myself to use a bucket in the downstairs half bath instead of flushing. The water still worked, but I did not know for how long, and I wanted as much in the pipes and tank as possible. Around 9 p.m, the radio broadcast shifted slightly in tone. There was another live announcement. This is an update from the Colorado Emergency Management Agency. Due to the scale of the infectious event, residents in outlying neighborhoods should not expect immediate assistance. We are focusing efforts on critical infrastructure and hospitals. If you are in a secure location with supplies, continue to shelter in place. If your shelter is compromised, you may attempt to relocate using the safest available route, avoiding major highways and large groups of infected individuals. Use extreme caution. They were no longer saying do not travel under any circumstances. They were acknowledging that some people would need to move on their own. I folded that detail into my mental calculations and came to a decision. I would leave. Not immediately. Not in the dark with the infected clustered randomly and my own energy low. But soon. Before the fences failed and the doors became focal points for that relentless pressure. The canal route was still my best option. It offered concealment, limited sightlines, and a direct path that avoided the most jammed streets. It carried its own risks, but they were distinct risks I could plan around instead of open unknowns in the middle of Main Street. I went upstairs, opened the attic hatch again, and climbed into the crawl space with my headlamp. From there, I crawled over to the gable vent that faced the backyard, a smaller twin of the front vent. Through its slats, I could see the strip of grass between my fence and the canal embankment, and a portion of the concrete channel itself. There were fewer infected near the canal than near the main road. I saw only one figure stagger along the far bank in the 5 minutes I watched. Most of the movement was still concentrated closer to the noise of the main road and the denser residential blocks. It gave me a plan. I would wait until the early morning hours, just before dawn, when the infected appeared to be less active. That was more a guess than a fact. But in the last 2 nights, the loudest activity had peaked in the late afternoon and early evening, and then settled to a duller background by the time the small hours arrived. Maybe people had stopped moving by then, giving the infected less stimulus. At that time, I would move from the attic onto the roof through the front gable vent. From the roof, I could see both front and back yards and choose the path with the fewest infected. Then I would move to the back of the roof, drop onto the small shed there, and from the shed into the yard, staying low. From the yard, I would cross to the fence corner near the canal, climb over, and slip down the embankment into the water. I would carry only what I needed: the duffel with essentials, the pistol with extra magazines, a small backpack with food and water, and a compact toolkit. Too much weight would slow me down and make the wading in the canal dangerous. Once in the canal, I would stay low, using the tall weeds at the edges for concealment, and move along the concrete bed toward the culvert under the first cross street. If I heard infected on the street above, I would wait in the shadow of the culvert until they moved on. I would avoid making any loud splashes or vocalizations. The water would be cold, but hypothermia was a slower threat than being caught on the street. I rehearsed the plan in my head several times, adjusting details until it felt as solid as it could under the circumstances. Then I prepared. I repacked the duffel more efficiently, removing non-essential items that had seemed important yesterday but were dead weight now. I moved the cash into a small waterproof pouch. I wrapped the pistol in a cloth and placed it at the top of the bag for quick access. I filled 2 stainless steel water bottles and stowed them. I added high-calorie, compact food, granola bars, peanut butter packets, packets of instant oatmeal, a few Ziploc bags of nuts. I slipped the multimeter into an outer pocket, along with a small roll of tape and a length of paracord. For light, I kept the headlamp, but also added a small hand-crank flashlight in case my batteries died sooner than expected. For navigation, I folded the paper map and sealed it in a plastic bag. I dressed in layers: moisture-wicking base layer, jeans, a fleece, and a waterproof shell. I pulled on my sturdiest boots, the ones I wore on construction sites, and laced them tight. I put on thin liner gloves and kept thicker work gloves in the duffel. I checked the clock on my phone. Its timekeeping was still accurate even with no network. It was 11:17 p.m. Outside, the sounds had shifted again. The earlier peaks of activity had flattened into a more steady background noise. Individual impacts on my walls or fence still occurred, but less frequently. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dim light of the headlamp, back against the living room wall, pistol on my knee, and waited, not for help, but for the right moment to move. The hours between midnight and 4 a.m. passed in slow segments. I dozed in short bursts, waking up every few minutes when the house ticked or the radio crackled. The emergency alert loop continued, but at lower volume. No new information came in. Around 3:30 a.m., I got up stiffly and walked one last circuit of the house, listening and feeling for any immediate breaches. The front door crossbars were still solid. The back door brace held. The fence creaked occasionally, but no concentrated pressure persisted for more than a few seconds. For now, the house remained intact. I pulled down the attic hatch, slung the duffel across my shoulders, and climbed up. I carried the pistol holstered at my belt. Once in the attic, I replaced the hatch panel loosely behind me to keep the visual profile of the ceiling the same if anyone looked up from below. I moved along the joist to the front gable vent. The slats were held by small nails and painted over. I set my headlamp to its lowest setting, directing it away from the vent, and used a flathead screwdriver to pry the slats one by one. The old paint cracked softly, flakes drifting down onto the sill. I caught each slat as it came loose and set it aside carefully to avoid clattering. When I had removed enough slats to create an opening I could squeeze through, I killed the headlamp and pressed my face close to the opening, letting my eyes adjust to the outside light. Dawn was just starting to lighten the eastern sky beyond the houses. It was that grey pre-sunrise light where details were visible but flat. Streetlights were still on, casting small circles on the pavement. The infected in the street moved more slowly now. Some stood still entirely, swaying slightly as if they were maintaining balance by instinct alone. There were still several in my immediate vicinity, but none were pressed directly against my walls or front steps. Two wandered in the yard across the street, brushing against the remains of a toppled garbage bin. Another leaned against a parked SUV further down, leaving a faint smear on the window. I scanned the sidewalks and yards slowly, counting. Within my immediate field of view, there were about 10 infected. Further away, near the main road, I could see more wandering between the lined-up cars, but they were not paying attention to my side street at the moment. I shifted in the vent opening and carefully swung my legs out onto the sloping roof. The shingles were rough under my boots, gritty with fine dust. The roof had a modest pitch, not steep, but I moved cautiously, spreading my weight and keeping a low center of gravity. The cool morning air hit my face, carrying the mixed smells of exhaust, dust, and the faint sour odor that hung in the air now. A combination of uncollected trash, spilled food, and something I did not want to identify more specifically. I eased myself fully onto the roof and lay flat for a moment, chest down, listening. No immediate change in the sounds below. None of the infected I could see had altered their behavior. That was a good sign. At this distance, my quiet movement on the roof was not drawing attention. I crawled slowly up toward the peak and then down toward the backside, staying as low as possible. From the ridge, I had a better angle on my backyard and the canal beyond. The backyard was partially shaded by the house itself, the grass damp and dark. My small shed sat in the back corner, its flat roof about 6 feet below the house roofline. The fence along the back property line was still intact, though its top edge leaned slightly inward in one section where the infected had pressed against it yesterday. Between the fence and the canal embankment, there was a strip of unkempt grass and weeds about 3 feet wide. Beyond that, the concrete slope dropped down into the canal, where water ran in a shallow, steady stream a couple of feet deep, moving east. At this moment, there were no infected in my backyard. I saw one figure near the neighbor's yard 2 houses over, but not directly behind mine. The canal itself was empty as far as I could see in either direction. The front looked more crowded. I risked a quick glance back. 2 infected had shifted closer to my driveway while I moved, but they were still several yards away and not looking up. They seemed more attracted to a distant noise coming from the main road, where someone was shouting. That settled it. The backyard route was still the better option. I scooted down the back slope of the roof until I reached the edge above the shed. From here, it was about a 6-foot vertical drop to its roof. I sat with my legs hanging over, gripped the edge with my hands, and lowered myself until I was dangling, arms fully extended. The drop from there was only a couple of feet. I let go and landed with a dull thump. The shed roof flexed slightly under my weight, but held. The impact was louder than I liked, but there was nothing to do about that now. I froze, crouched low, and listened. From the other side of the fence, I heard a change in the pattern of footsteps. Something shuffled closer, then bumped against the fence. A low, sustained vocalization drifted over the boards. It sounded very close. I held my breath. The duffel strap dug into my shoulder. The seconds stretched. The shuffling moved along the fence, away from my position, then stopped. The vocalization faded. No new impacts followed. I exhaled slowly and eased toward the corner of the shed roof closest to the canal. From here, it was another drop of about 8 feet to the grass in my backyard. I sat, swung my legs over, and lowered myself again as far as I could. The drop from my hands to the ground was about 3 feet. I let go and landed with my knees bent to absorb the impact, doing my best to minimize noise on the soft grass. The fence loomed ahead of me now, its wooden boards about 6 feet tall. On the other side, the strip of grass and then the canal embankment awaited. I moved to the corner where the boards were slightly lower due to the yard's slope. There was a section where a previous owner had nailed an extra horizontal brace about halfway up. I put my foot on it, grabbed the top of the fence with my hands, and pulled myself up. For a second, my head and shoulders rose above the fence line, giving me a wider view. To my left, 2 infected moved slowly along the neighbour's yard, one brushing its shoulder against the fence, the other drifting near a tree. To my right, the canal embankment and the strip of grass were empty. The concrete channel itself carried its thin ribbon of water eastward, glinting faintly in the early light. I swung one leg over the fence and then the other, balancing carefully on the narrow top edge. The wood creaked under my weight. I did not pause long. I shifted my weight forward and dropped down onto the grass strip outside my yard, landing in a crouch. The embankment was only a few feet away. I could hear the gentle, steady sound of water moving over concrete. I glanced to both sides once more. No infected in the immediate vicinity were looking in my direction. I slid down the embankment on my backside, boots scraping lightly against the concrete, and stepped into the canal. The water was colder than I expected. It soaked into my boots and pants immediately, seeping through to my socks and skin. It reached just below my knees in the center of the channel. The current was not strong, but the algae and silt on the concrete made the footing slick. I took a moment to steady myself, spreading my stance and using my arms for balance. The duffel shifted on my back. I adjusted the strap so it rode higher, away from the water. Then I crouched, lowering my profile until my shoulders were below the top of the embankment, and began to move east along the canal, one careful step at a time. Tall weeds and grasses grew along parts of the embankment, arching over the water in places to create natural tunnels of cover. Where they were thickest, I stayed close to the edge, using them as concealment. Where they thinned, I hunched lower and moved faster. The sounds of the neighborhood changed as I moved. The main road noise faded slightly, replaced by softer, more local sounds. A door banging in the wind, a distant shout, a dog's single bark. Above me, houses slid past, visible only as silhouettes against the lightening sky when I risked a quick glance up. The cold of the water seeped deeper into my legs, numbing my skin from the knees down. I kept moving, focusing on placing each foot carefully to avoid slipping. After about 10 minutes, the canal approached its first major cross street. The concrete channel narrowed slightly and then dipped under the road in a rectangular box culvert. The opening was large enough to walk through if you crouched. Shadows pulled thickly inside. I stopped just before the culvert and listened. Above, on the road, I could hear faint footsteps and a low murmur. It was impossible to tell if the sounds came from living people or infected. Either way, passing directly above them on the open street was not an option. Underneath, in the culvert, I would be out of sight but confined. Once inside, I would have limited ability to turn around or move quickly if something dropped in behind me. I waited, watching the culvert entrance and listening to the rhythm of the sounds above. They did not seem to be directly over the opening at this moment. They were more toward the center of the intersection. I took a breath and went in. The air inside the culvert was cooler and damp. The ceiling was low enough that I had to stoop, keeping my head down and my shoulders slightly hunched. The water was a little deeper here, lapping at my knees with each step. Halfway through, I heard a faint scuff above my head and paused. Dust drifted down from a crack in the concrete overhead, catching what little light filtered through. Sound moved on, then faded. I did not move until it was gone. Then I continued, focusing only on the rectangle of lighter grey at the far end. When I emerged on the other side, the sky seemed much brighter after the dim culvert. I blinked and crouched lower again, staying below the embankment lip as I resumed my slow progress. The second cross street was about the same distance ahead. Between here and there, the canal passed behind a small park. I could see a patch of open grassy area through gaps between the houses, with play structures and benches. The idea of cutting across the park to take a street seemed attractive for a moment. It would be faster on dry ground than in the slippery canal. But parks were natural gathering points. If anyone had tried to shelter there, or if infected had wandered into it, I would be exposed in the open for too long. I stayed in the canal. As I moved, I thought about Megan's apartment. It was on the third floor of a building that backed onto a parking lot, which in turn bordered a narrow greenbelt. If I could follow the canal to the point where it crossed that greenbelt, I could cut over on foot without going all the way out to the main road. The canal curved slightly to the right, and the park opened up more fully to my left. Through the tall weeds, I saw a swing set hanging motionless, seats swaying slightly in the light breeze. No figures moved there. That emptiness was almost worse than seeing infected. The world felt hollowed out. The second culvert came into view, carrying the canal under another road. This one was slightly shorter but darker, with more debris caught at its entrance, branches, plastic bags, and a stray soccer ball wedged against the concrete. I waded toward it, lifting my knees higher to avoid tripping. As I got closer, I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a splash, faint but distinct from inside the culvert. I stopped where I was, water swirling gently around my legs. I tilted my head, listening carefully. Another splash, then a dragging sound somewhere inside the tunnel. Something else was in there. It could have been a piece of debris shifting, loosened by the current. It could have been an animal, trapped and trying to get out. Or it could have been an infected person who had wandered into the canal and ended up in the tunnel. I did not relish the idea of sharing that confined space with any of those possibilities. I glanced up at the embankment. On the street above, I could hear nothing to suggest heavy infected presence nearby. The earlier murmur of the neighborhood felt thinner here. I backed quietly toward the embankment wall and climbed slowly up the concrete slope, using my hands for balance. At the top, I stopped with my eyes just below the edge and raised them carefully for a look. The cross street above was lined with parked cars, some at odd angles, others neatly in their usual places. A couple of trash bins lay on their sides. There were no people or infected in immediate sight. I scanned left and right twice, heart thumping. Still nothing obvious. If I could cross the street quickly and drop back into the canal on the other side, I could avoid whatever was in that culvert. It was a calculated risk, but so was everything else. I took one last look, then pushed myself up over the embankment and onto the grassy edge, staying low. I jogged across the narrow strip of grass, then stepped onto the asphalt. My wet boots squeaked faintly. I moved as fast as I dared, without breaking into a full run, duffel bouncing lightly on my back. The street felt unnaturally open after the confined space of the canal. Every parked car looked like it could hide something behind it. I forced myself not to look into any windows, focusing instead on the opposite embankment. Halfway across, I heard a sound behind me, a shoe scuff, followed by a low exhale. I did not turn immediately. Turn could break my stride, and I needed to reach the other side. I counted 3 more steps in my head, then risked a quick glance over my shoulder. An infected man stood at the corner of a driveway, about 20 yards away, facing me. His clothes were dirty and torn, his arms hanging at his sides, his head tilted slightly as he watched my movement. His eyes did not blink. He let out a longer vocalization, a kind of drawn-out exhale with a hint of sound at the end. I did not slow down. I crossed the remaining distance to the opposite embankment and slid down it, boots skidding on the concrete. The infected at the driveway began to move toward where I'd been, his steps slow but steady. I dropped back into the canal, water splashing higher around my knees this time. I crouched under the embankment's lip, breathing hard, and pressed myself against the concrete wall. Above me, I heard footsteps reach the spot where I had crossed. They paused. The low vocalization came again, Quieter now, but longer. Then the footsteps moved parallel to the canal, following the embankment for a few yards. I stayed completely still, resisting the urge to adjust my position. The cold water wrapped my legs, and a faint shiver ran up my spine. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Then, to my relief, they moved on, away from the canal, back along the street, possibly following some other distant sound. I waited another full minute, counting slowly, before I dared to move again. When I resumed walking, my legs felt heavier, both from the cold and from the accumulation of adrenaline. Still, I kept going. There was nothing to be gained by turning back now. My house was receding behind me with every step. My sister's apartment complex lay somewhere ahead. The canal began to curve more noticeably. Houses on one side gave way to the back of a small strip mall. I recognized the dumpsters and loading bay from past errands. There would likely be more infected near the front of that building, where the grocery store entrance faced the parking lot. I stayed low and moved carefully, avoiding any splashes that might carry abnormally far in the quiet. At one point, I heard a high-pitched shout from the strip mall area, followed by a series of impacts and a brief flurry of gunshots. The sound echoed off the building walls. Several infected silhouettes appeared against the sky near the roofline, reacting to the noise. I stayed in the shadow of the canal, grateful for my choice of route. Eventually, the strip mall receded, replaced by another run of residential fences. The canal straightened and then intersected with a wider drainage channel coming in from the north. This was my landmark. The map had shown this junction near the greenbelt behind Megan's apartment complex. I paused at the convergence point and checked my bearings. The apartment buildings would be 2 blocks to the south from here, accessed through the greenbelt and a small walking path. If I stayed in the canal, I would overshoot slightly and have to double back on surface streets. If I left the canal here and cut across the drainage area and the greenbelt, I could approach the complex from the back, where there would be fewer cars and likely fewer infected. I decided to leave the canal. Climbing out was more difficult this time. My legs felt stiff and the cold water had numbed my knees. I gritted my teeth, dug my fingers into small irregularities in the concrete and hauled myself up. Water streamed off my pants and boots, darkening the grass at the embankment's edge. The greenbelt stretched ahead, a strip of land with scattered trees and a narrow dirt path winding through it. In calmer times, Megan had used this path for her morning runs. Now, it was empty. I stayed near the tree line, moving from trunk to trunk, using them as intermittent cover. My eyes scanned constantly for movement. At the far end of the greenbelt, the back of the apartment complex came into view. 3-story buildings with beige siding and red brick accents stood lined up in a row, their balconies facing the parking lot. Megan's unit was in the 3rd building, 3rd floor, 2nd from the left. I had been there countless times, carrying boxes on move-on day, bringing over dinner on birthdays, helping her fix a squeaky door. The parking lot was full of cars. Some were parked neatly in their designated spaces. Others were diagonally across lines, abandoned mid-turn or angled toward the exit. A couple of vehicles had their doors hanging open. I dropped to a crouch behind a hedge at the edge of the greenbelt and studied the lot. There were infected here as well, though fewer than along the main roads. I counted 6 that I could see, 1 near the central mailbox kiosk, drifting aimlessly between cars, another standing in the middle of a lane, turning its head occasionally, 2 more near the far entrance, moving slowly in a rough circle. The last 2 were closer to the building itself, one brushing its hand along the railing of the ground floor walkway, the other near a stairwell. I watched their paths for a full 5 minutes, trying to detect any pattern. There was no coordination, but there was randomness, which in some ways was worse. Any movement I made could cross their attention at the wrong moment. I needed to reach the stairwell at the near end of Megan's building, go up 2 flights, and get to her door without drawing too much focus. I took a deep, steady breath, adjusted the duffel on my shoulder, and moved. I crossed the last few yards of grass at a brisk walk, then stepped into the parking lot lane, boots squishing faintly with each step. I kept my head down and shoulders squared. like I had a clear purpose, because hesitation can attract attention, even from normal people. I hoped the infected would be more focused on sound than on subtle body language. Halfway to the building, one of the infected near the mailbox kiosk turned its head toward me. Its eyes tracked my movement. It began to drift my way, steps slow but linear. I did not look directly at it. I kept walking toward the stairwell, shortening my strides only slightly. By the time I reached the base of the stairs, the infected near the mailbox had reduced the distance between us by half, but was still far enough away that I had a little time. The infected near the stairwell itself, the one I had seen earlier, was no longer visible. It must have moved elsewhere while I was crossing. I took the stairs two at a time, ignoring the protest from my cold, tired legs. Metal rattled under my boots. The duffel thumped against my back. At the first landing, I risked a quick look back. The infected in the parking lot had changed their behavior. Two more had turned toward the sound of my movement on the stairs. They were adjusting their paths, converging slowly toward the base of the stairwell. I didn't have much margin now. I climbed the second flight to the third floor walkway, stepped onto the concrete corridor and turned towards Megan's door. It was 10 steps away, with a faded welcome mat in front of it. The small peephole in the center of the door looked dark and empty. I reached the door and knocked twice, firmly but not loudly. "Megan, it's me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's Caleb. Open up if you're in there." There was no immediate answer. I knocked again, 3 times, a little louder. "Megan, please," I said. "It's me. I came from my place. If you're in there, answer me." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then I heard something from inside, a faint scrape, the sound of something sliding on wood, a pause, then a soft voice through the door. "Say something only you would know," Megan said. Her voice shook slightly, but she was thinking clearly enough to be cautious. I exhaled in relief. "When you were 10, you fell off your bike and broke your wrist, and you painted your cast with that glitter nail polish Mum hated," I said. "You made me sign it 5 times because you said my signature kept getting better." There was a short, choked sound from inside that could have been a laugh or a sob. Then I heard the chain slide, the deadbolt turn, and the door opened a few inches. Megan's eyes appeared in the crack, wide and red-rimmed, but bright with recognition. She opened the door the rest of the way and pulled me inside quickly, shutting it behind me and locking it again. "You're soaked," she said, voice on the edge of breaking as she hugged me just long enough to confirm I was real. "What did you do? Swim here?" "Canal," I said. "I had to avoid the main roads. Are you alone?" She stepped back, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Yeah," she said. "My roommate left yesterday morning to try to get to her parents in Greeley. I haven't heard from her since. The building was quiet most of the night, but there were people in the hallway earlier, banging on doors. I didn't open mine." "Good," I said. "Keep not opening it unless you're absolutely sure. Do you have food and water?" She nodded toward the kitchen, where cases of bottled water and stacks of canned goods lined the counter and floor. "I went to the store yesterday before it got really bad," she said. "People were already panicking, but I managed to grab some stuff. I've been trying to stay quiet since then. The power went out around midnight." "It did at my place too," I said. "The grid is probably down over a wide area." I set the duffel down and felt a wave of fatigue wash over me, now that the immediate need to move had passed. My legs ached from the canal trek. My feet were numb and heavy. Megan saw my expression and pointed to the bathroom. "There are towels in there," she said. "I'll get you dry clothes. You can borrow some of my sweats for now. We can worry about sizes later." I almost laughed at that, and the normalcy of it helped hold the rest of my frayed nerves together. In the bathroom, I peeled off my wet pants and socks, dried my legs as best I could, and put on the clothes she handed me through the door. The sweats were a little short, and the waistband was snug, but they were dry and warm. When I came back out, Megan was by the window, peeking carefully through the blinds. "They followed you," she said quietly. "There are more of them down there now." I moved beside her and looked through the slim gap. Below, in the parking lot, 3 infected had gathered near the base of our stairwell. One stood directly at the foot of the steps, looking up. Another drifted a little further away, head tilted as if listening. The third moved between cars, circling back in a loose loop. I made noise on the stairs, I said. It drew them. They've been around all night, Megan said. Sometimes they pound on doors. I think someone let one into Building C earlier. I heard screaming and then nothing for a while. I nodded slowly. The situation here was no better than at Cedar Ridge. The only real difference was elevation. The 3rd floor walkway offered some refuge from immediate ground-level contact, but the doors were still just wood and metal. They could be forced if enough pressure was applied. "What's the plan?" she asked, voice level but eyes searching mine. I looked around her apartment. Solid enough, but not built to withstand a prolonged siege any more than my house had been. She had supplies for a few days. I had brought more. Together we could stretch it longer. But outside, the number of infected was growing, not shrinking. The radio back at my house had not offered any quick resolution. The view from the canal and the streets had shown no sign of organized rescue moving into residential areas yet. We were safer here than we would be out in the open, at least for now. But long term, this building was another temporary haven in a city that was rapidly losing control. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I know we can't count on anyone coming to get us right away. We'll have to fortify this place as much as we can, stay quiet, and watch for any sign of organized evacuation. If none comes, we'll have to think about getting out of the city ourselves, maybe heading toward a less populated area." Megan nodded slowly. "I figured," she said. "I'm glad you made it here, though. I was starting to think I was going to ride this out alone." "You're not alone," I said. "We're in this together now." We stood at the window in silence for a moment, watching the infected wander between the cars below, their slow, uncoordinated paths crisscrossing the lot. The sky brightened as the sun crept further above the horizon, illuminating the damage to the world we had known. Behind us, the apartment was quiet and still, a small pocket of relative calm above the chaos. My clothes hung damp over the edge of the bathtub. My duffel sat on the floor by the couch, its contents ready for whatever the next phase of this outbreak would require. I took a slow breath and let it out, feeling the weight of the last 48 hours settle into my bones. 48 hours ago, I had woken up to a buzzing phone and a routine workday ahead of me. Now I stood in my sister's apartment, city falling apart outside, the dead moving in our parking lot, and no clear path back to anything resembling normal. But I was alive. Megan was alive. I had made it out of my house, through the canal, past the infected, to this new temporary shelter. The world beyond the blinds was changing fast, and I had no idea how far the damage had spread. All I knew was that for the moment, we had each other, supplies, and a high vantage point. And as long as we kept thinking clearly, kept adapting, and kept moving when we had to, there was still a chance to survive whatever came next. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.